What if the very awakening humanity worships as salvation is also a descent into an interior night deeper than any known sorrow? What if the path toward higher consciousness is not an ascent through celestial light, but a deliberate passage through corridors of shadow where the soul confronts the ruins of its own false identity? What if enlightenment is not comfort, but a sacred unraveling, an initiatic erosion of the self that once believed it was whole? Within the veiled doctrines preserved by Helena Blavatsky rests a truth rarely welcomed. Awakening dismantles before it reveals, humiliates before it sanctifies, and empties before it fills the spirit with eternal wisdom. This is the dark side of awakening, the forbidden phase of initiation, the abyss that intelligence must traverse before remembrance of the eternal self can occur. The unawakened imagine illumination as serenity, as celestial peace, as graceful harmony with divine forces. They envision awakening as the reward of virtue, a crown placed gently upon the head of the seeker. Yet the true initiate discovers something far more severe. Awakening is rupture. Awakening is unsettlement. Awakening is the slow, painful collapse of all structures in which the personality sought security. Every belief once held sacred begins to tremble. Every emotional identity forged in the theater of time begins to dissolve. The soul stands upon ground that no longer supports its illusion, and the mind, trained in deception, panics before the vastness of truth. Blavatsky teaches that what humanity calls reality is but Maya, the shimmering illusion cast upon the surface of the absolute. The world perceived through the senses, structured by logic, and defined by emotional reaction, is merely a shadow play of transient forms. When awakening begins, this veil grows thin, and through its fractures emerges a dreadful clarity. Much of what was loved, feared, defended, and pursued was nothing more than a temporary mirage. The seeker is seized by an existential vertigo, for the foundations of personal meaning collapse in silence. The dark side of awakening manifests as a stripping away of certainty. The voice of the ego, once persuasive, once protective, now becomes exposed as an imposter. It trembles before annihilation. It resists disintegration. It clings to memory, to narrative, to attachment, to story, yet something deeper observes silently from within, a presence that neither trembles nor resists, a consciousness untouched by emotional storms. This is the hidden observer, the eternal witness beyond time and identity. Have you ever questioned who truly observes within you? Is the self you defend truly real, or merely a phantom born of circumstance, culture, trauma, and conditioning? The moment such questions arise, awakening has already begun. The illusion of individuality fractures, and the seeker senses a terrifying freedom emerging from the ruins of the known self. Is suffering not the echo of forgotten wisdom? Is pain not the sacred signal of separation from one's true essence? In the initiatic phase of awakening, sorrow intensifies, but not as punishment. It manifests as revelation. The soul is being shown the cost of illusion. Every grief becomes a teacher. Every disappointment becomes a gate. Every loss becomes a silent guide toward deeper truth. The initiate experiences profound solitude. Friends, family, society, all seem distant, operating within collective dreams from which the seeker has begun to awaken. Language grows insufficient to describe the inner metamorphosis now unfolding. The world continues mechanically, yet the soul walks through invisible fire. This dissonance births anguish, but also clarity. The initiate is painfully aware that there is no return to innocence once truth begins to unveil itself. The ego, confronted with its coming extinction, attempts to disguise itself as spirituality. It seeks comfort in superficial light, in diluted wisdom, in doctrines that promise transcendence without sacrifice. Yet true awakening refuses compromise. It demands the surrender of mask, illusion, and identity. It insists the initiate pass through inner death before rediscovering authentic being. In this stage, the seeker stares directly into the void beneath personality. They face the terrifying question, who am I without the stories I have built about myself? What remains when all labels dissolve? The dark night of awakening is not merely emotional, it is ontological. It dissolves the very concept of selfhood. Yet even eerie, within the depth of this sacred darkness, a quiet flame persists, the inner fire, the divine spark. It flickers with patient authority, guiding the soul forward when the mind collapses. It calls the seeker beyond illusion, beyond fear, beyond attachment, into remembrance of the higher self that has always existed beyond time and form. The path narrows, the seeker grows silent, illusion thins with every breath. The world becomes transparent, and existence itself begins to feel like a dream dissolving under the gaze of eternal awareness. And so, the initiate stands at the edge of an even deeper mystery, knowing that what has begun cannot be undone. Consciousness now faces its own infinite mirror. The soul trembles before the realization that every identity at once cherished must fall away so that truth may emerge unbound. The silence thickens, the illusion weakens, the shadow deepens, and an unspoken question begins to echo through the inner chambers of being. Suspended like incense before an unseen altar, what remains when the final illusion collapses and the eternal observer stands revealed beyond the veil? If this reflection resonates with your spirit, feel free to support this sacred journey by leaving a like, subscribing to this channel, and sharing your insight in the comments. Your presence helps keep this space of wisdom alive, deepening the mystery. The seeker who has crossed the initial threshold of awakening soon perceives that this transformation is not a singular event, but an inexorable process governed by invisible laws older than time itself. Beneath every tremor of uncertainty, beneath every shattering of identity, flows a silent intelligence that orchestrates the evolution of consciousness across epochs. This intelligence is karma not as moral punishment, but as divine equilibrium, the sacred architecture through which the soul reclaims awareness of its forgotten divinity. Blavatsky reveals that awakening does not emerge spontaneously. It unfolds through cycles of remembrance carried across reincarnation. The soul journeys through countless lives, donning and discarding forms as a traveler moves through worlds. Each incarnation becomes a chapter in a vast initiatic curriculum written upon the fabric of eternity. Yet the dark side of awakening reveals itself when the seeker begins to remember fragments of this eternal pilgrimage. Echoes of ancient sorrows, unfulfilled destinies, unresolved vows, and forgotten wisdom rise from the depths of the Akasha, the imperishable record of all experience. This remembrance is not gentle. It destabilizes the seeker. The realization dawns that existence extends far beyond the memory of one lifetime. The individual begins to sense an inner continuity that transcends temporal boundaries, revealing that every thought, every action, every desire reverberates through planes unseen. The weight of this awareness transforms perception. Life no longer feels accidental. Every moment becomes sacred, and every choice assumes metaphysical consequence. The dark side of awakening emerges in this sacred comprehension of responsibility. Ignorance once protected the soul from the burden of cosmic accountability. Now awareness exposes the intricate web of causation linking intention to destiny. Freedom reveals its true depth, entwined with consequence, revealing that the awakened soul must face every creation it has set into motion. The divine spark within no longer whispers as comfort, but as it summons the initiate toward purification, coherence, and sacred discipline. The soul begins to recognize that the path is not linear but circular, spiraling deeper into its own essence. As remembrance expands, the initiate senses that the soul is not a fragment isolated in an indifferent cosmos, but a living expression of universal brotherhood, the mystical unity of all beings, bound by the same eternal source. This realization dissolves superficial individuality. Isolation crumbles. Compassion arises not as moral sentiment, but as metaphysical knowing. The initiate perceives others not as separate entities, but as reflections of the same divine essence unfolding through innumerable forms. Yet, with this revelation comes grave humility, for the seeker now understands the magnitude of their own participation in the cosmic order. The world grows strange. The profane realm reveals its transient nature, while the sacred realm remains only partially unveiled. Dreams deepen. Synchronistic patterns emerge. Reality itself begins to feel fluid, symbolic, layered with hidden intelligences speaking through signs and silence. The initiate perceives life not as random occurrence, but as orchestrated initiation guided by unseen hands of cosmic wisdom. And yet, Despite these revelations, peace does not immediately arrive. The ego continues its struggle, fearing dissolution, bargaining for survival, disguising itself as seeker, sage, or savior. The initiate discovers that awakening does not eradicate the ego instantly. It unmasks it layer by layer, revealing its countless disguises and subtle dominion. In this tension, the seeker walks between the worlds of shadow and light, aware of eternal truths, yet not fully liberated from human limitation. Doubt arises. Longing intensifies. Silence deepens. The soul feels suspended over the abyss of self-transcendence, trembling before the step that cannot yet be fully taken. Is suffering not the echo of forgotten wisdom? Here, suffering becomes sacred pressure, forging the inner being into greater refinement. Every challenge sharpens perception. Every sorrow polishes awareness. The initiate begins to understand that awakening is not escape from the world, but a profound reorientation within it, transforming perception into sacred vision. The Akashic current flows ever stronger. Memories that once belonged to oblivion now surface as intuition, dream, and mystical insight. The initiate perceives the invisible continuity of being, sensing that every incarnation is a lesson, every breath a step in the infinite pilgrimage of consciousness returning to its source. The deeper the awakening, the more silence envelops the soul. The mind grows still. The reasoning intellect bows before unknown wisdom. A sacred anticipation emerges, signaling that the final dissolution of illusion approaches. The initiate stands before a threshold where surrender becomes inevitable. And here, within the chambers of this solemn awareness, the seeker senses the approaching dissolution of all identity once held dear. A sacred cessation waits beyond the final barrier of ego. What remains when even the subtlest sense of separation dissolves into the boundless ocean of being? The mystery thickens. The silence expands. The final transformation waits beyond the invisible veil. Consecration of consciousness at the deepest point of awakening, where language falters and the intellect bows before the unknown. The initiate encounters the sacred chamber of pure awareness. This is the silent temple where no thought echoes and no illusion survives. The final confrontation is not with darkness, but with the last remnant of the self that claims separation. Here begins the true consecration of consciousness. The path now demands a radical act of inner surrender. The seeker must learn to observe without grasping, to perceive without naming, to exist without clinging to identity. Self-observation becomes the sacred discipline through which the soul witnesses the rise and fall of its own illusions. Every thought is seen as transient, every emotion as passing vapor, every memory as a ripple upon the infinite sea of being. In this profound stillness, the ego dissolves, not through violence, but through recognition of its unreality. The initiate perceives that the self it once defended was never the true knower, never the eternal witness, but merely a shadow projected upon the walls of perception. As this realization dawns, a sacred silence envelops the inner realm, gentle yet irrevocable. Blavatsky reminds us that the higher self does not descend. It reveals itself as what has always been. The divine spark, long obscured by illusion, now shines with serene clarity. The soul aligns with this inner flame, no longer seeking external validation, recognition, or comfort. It rests within the unchanging presence that observes without judgment and exists beyond time. The dark side of awakening fulfills its sacred purpose. The nights of confusion, the storms of doubt, the abyss of spiritual loneliness now reveal themselves as necessary initiations. They have stripped the consciousness of all false adornment so that truth may emerge uncorrupted, unfiltered, and eternal. In this consecrated state, perception transforms. The world is no longer seen as a battleground of separate selves, but as a living tapestry woven from a single cosmic essence. The initiate understands universal brotherhood not as philosophy, but as lived reality. Separation dissolves, and compassion flows effortlessly from recognition of shared being. Sacred silence now becomes the throne upon which consciousness rests. It is not emptiness, but fullness beyond comprehension, not darkness, but infinite presence. Within this silence, the initiate no longer resists the flow of existence, but moves in harmony with its divine rhythm, surrendered yet sovereign, humble yet infinite. The veil has lifted. The eternal observer stands revealed. The soul, once fragmented by illusion, now walks in alignment with the greater order of being. It understands that awakening is not an end, but an eternal unfolding, a sacred spiral deeper into wisdom, deeper into remembrance, deeper into truth. No longer driven by fear or attachment, the initiate becomes a quiet witness to the divine mystery unfolding through life itself becomes a ritual. Every breath, a prayer, every moment, an initiation into deeper consciousness. And so, standing within the sanctuary of the inner flame, the soul whispers not as seeker, but as silent knower, embracing the realization that all darkness was but the shadow cast by an approaching eternal light. Share your insight in the comments. If this touched your soul, subscribe for more wisdom. May your inner fire awaken today.